A cold wind swept through the cemetery in the heart of New York, the leaves golden and crisp scattered across the freshly dug grave, as Jackson Montgomery, a powerful Wall Street mogul, stood frozen. Today, his empire didn't matter. His wealth didn't matter. The only thing that consumed him was the woman he had loved and lost, Eleanor. But something unexpected caught his eye. 3 identical little girls, no older than 8, stood silently behind a towering oak tree, their gazes locked on him. They wore simple coats, their faces pale, expressionless. Yet their eyes, those eyes seemed to see right through him. He didn't recognize them. They weren't relatives. They weren't business partners' children. But in that moment, he felt something deep in his chest, a strange pull toward them, an undeniable connection he couldn't explain. As the crowd moved away and the funeral ended, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that this was no coincidence. Who were they? Why were they watching him? What he discovered next would shatter everything he thought he knew about his past and change his future forever. Do you think Jackson is about to uncover a long-hidden secret? What do you think the girls have to do with his past? Drop your thoughts below and don't forget to like and share if you're hooked. The cold wind swept across the graveyard of Oakwood in Rhode Island, the autumn leaves rustling underfoot as they gathered around the freshly dug grave. The sky hung a dull gray, perfectly mirroring the sorrow that weighed on the hearts of those gathered below. Among them stood Jackson Montgomery, a man known for his vast fortune and his empire on Wall Street. To the world, he was a powerful figure, a ruthless investor with a keen mind and a relentless drive for success. But today, none of that mattered. Today, Jackson was just a man who had lost the love of his life, Eleanor. She had been his anchor, his confidant, the one who had seen through the facade of wealth and power. Together, they had built a life filled with love, laughter, and quiet regrets. The regret that they never had children, something they had both dreamed of, but never had the chance to pursue. Now, as he stood by her grave, watching as her coffin was lowered into the earth, a suffocating emptiness filled his chest. It was as though a part of him had been buried with her. The funeral had been grand, as expected. Rhode Island's elite had gathered, some out of genuine grief, others simply because it was the event of the season. Colleagues, business partners, and friends all stepped forward to offer their condolences, but Jackson barely registered any of it. His world had gone silent, drowned in the echoes of Eleanor's laughter, the warmth of her voice that he would never hear again. He longed for the crowd to disappear, for the world to leave him alone with his grief. But he knew that was impossible. A man like him was never truly alone, except when it mattered. As the service drew to a close and the crowd began to disperse, Jackson remained still, staring at the polished wood of the coffin, now covered in dirt. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled his coat tighter around himself, the cold creeping through the fabric. His driver, Thomas, a loyal man who had been with the Montgomery family for decades, patiently waited at a distance, understanding that Jackson needed this moment. But just as Jackson took a deep breath to turn and leave, something caught his eye, something unusual. 3 small figures stood near the edge of the cemetery, partially hidden behind a large oak tree. At first they appeared to be just children, but as Jackson studied them, a strange feeling washed over him. There, standing with eerie synchronization, were 3 identical little girls, their red hair tied neatly into ponytails, their dark blue coats standing out against the gray backdrop of the cemetery. Their faces were pale and their expressions unreadable as they gazed at him with an intensity far beyond their years. They weren't dressed like the other mourners, most of whom wore expensive black coats and designer scarves. No, these children wore simple jackets and dresses, looking entirely out of place among the well-dressed crowd. Jackson squinted, trying to make sense of the sight before him. He didn't recognize them from any family gatherings, nor did they seem to belong to any of the business partners who had attended the funeral. But something about them made his heart beat faster, though he couldn't explain why. One of the girls, the one who stood slightly apart from the others, hesitated for a moment before taking a tentative step forward, as though reconsidering her decision. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and Jackson felt an inexplicable pull toward them. Before he could move or say anything, all 3 girls turned in perfect unison and disappeared behind the oak tree, vanishing from sight. "Jackson?" Thomas's voice broke through his thoughts, reminding him that the car was waiting. The moment was over, but the girls, those strange, identical girls, lingered in his mind, their gazes etched into his memory. Later that night, as Jackson sat in his penthouse overlooking the twinkling lights of Manhattan, the image of the three girls haunted him. He wasn't the type of man to dwell on strangers, especially children, but something about their presence at the cemetery felt significant. It wasn't just a random encounter, it was as if fate had placed them there for a reason. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling beneath the dim light of his office. His eyes drifted to a framed photo of Eleanor on his desk. "I miss you," he whispered softly, his voice cracking. Eleanor had always been the one to see the meaning in things, the one who believed that everything happened for a reason. If she were here, she would have told him to trust his instincts about the girls, but she wasn't here, and Jackson found himself wondering whether his grief was simply playing tricks on his mind. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. That wasn't the last time he would see those girls. Do you think the girls' presence at the cemetery is connected to something deeper in Jackson's past? What do you expect will happen next? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like and share it with your friends. The following days passed in a blur for Jackson Montgomery. Despite his attempts to bury the encounter with the girls at the cemetery, they refused to leave his thoughts. Each time he tried to focus on work or distract himself with his wealth and empire, their faces, those three identical, piercing eyes, seemed to be waiting for him in the corners of his mind. One evening, as Jackson walked through his penthouse, the weight of the loneliness that had settled in since Eleanor's death seemed to pull at him with greater force. He poured another glass of whiskey, the amber liquid shimmering in the dim light. He couldn't escape the feeling that something important had been left unfinished. Eleanor had always believed in fate, in signs, in the deeper meanings behind things. Was this one of those signs? "Maybe it's just grief playing tricks on me," he muttered to himself. But even as the words left his lips, he knew they weren't true. This was different. Suddenly, a thought struck him. He had to know who those girls were. He picked up the phone and dialed Thomas. "Thomas, do you remember the three little girls from the cemetery? The ones who were watching me?" "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" "I need you to find out who they are," Jackson said, his voice filled with urgency. "Check with the cemetery staff, anyone who might know. Get me any information you can." "Understood, Mr. Montgomery," Thomas replied, sensing the seriousness in his boss's tone. The next few days dragged on as Jackson tried to keep his mind occupied, though he found it nearly impossible to focus on anything else. He had to know the truth. Who were they? What did they want from him? Then late one afternoon, Thomas finally called back with the information Jackson had been waiting for. "Mr. Montgomery, I found them," Thomas said on the phone, his voice calm but with a hint of surprise. "Their names are Harper, Haley, and Hannah Wilson. They're 8 years old. They live in Brooklyn with their aunt, Charlotte Wilson. Their mother, Meredith Wilson, passed away 3 months ago." Jackson's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Meredith's name. Meredith Wilson. The name echoed in his mind, bringing with it a flood of memories he hadn't thought about in years. It was her, the woman he had once loved, a brilliant professor of literature at Columbia University. They had met at a charity gala when they were both younger, and their connection had been instant. The passion, the intellectual bond. They had shared something deep, something real. But as his career took off, he had chosen to leave her behind, moving to London to pursue bigger opportunities. He had never known she had been carrying his children. The revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. "Wait, Thomas," Jackson said, his voice low with disbelief. "Are you sure about this? Are these really my daughters?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Thomas replied, "Yes, sir, I checked. They're yours. The dates match up perfectly with when you were still seeing Meredith. They're your daughters, Jackson." Jackson felt as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. His mind raced as he processed the revelation. He had children, 3 of them, and he hadn't even known. The days that followed were filled with confusion, anger, and regret. Jackson couldn't help but feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. How had he not known about his daughters? Why hadn't Meredith reached out to him? Was it because of his career? Or was it something else? The more Jackson thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew about Meredith's life after they had parted ways. Had she been alone all those years, raising their daughters without any help from him? His thoughts turned to the girls, their quiet intensity, the way they had watched him at the cemetery with such knowing eyes. They weren't just strangers, they were his flesh and blood. "I need to meet them," Jackson whispered to himself. He couldn't just stand by and let this opportunity slip away. He needed to know them, to understand who they were, what they had gone through, and what role he could play in their lives, if any. The next day, he arranged a meeting. It wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't going to walk in and announce himself as their father. That would be too much, too soon. He needed to approach this carefully, with patience. Jackson sat in his limousine, parked across the street from their school in Park Slope, Brooklyn. He watched as children poured out of the building, their backpacks slung over their shoulders. It didn't take long for him to spot them. Harper, Haley, and Hannah. They walked together side by side, their heads down, talking quietly among themselves. They were identical in every way, but Jackson could see the differences in their personalities. Harper was the first to notice him. She stopped walking and glanced in his direction. Her eyes met his through the tinted window of the limousine. There was no surprise in her gaze, no curiosity, only a quiet recognition, as though she had been expecting him. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't prepared for this moment. The uncertainty of what to say, what to do was overwhelming. But before he could move or even gather his thoughts, the girls turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Later that evening, Jackson sat in his office alone. The girls' faces haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they knew something he didn't. They had seen him, and yet they hadn't said a word. He had been so focused on them that he hadn't even realized that they had been watching him for longer than he had thought. Had they known who he was the entire time? Had they been waiting for him to acknowledge them? Or was this all some kind of test? He picked up his phone and dialed Thomas again. "I need to meet them," Jackson said firmly. "I need to speak to Charlotte, their aunt. Set up a meeting." "Are you sure, Mr. Montgomery?" Thomas asked, his voice cautious. "I have to," Jackson replied. "It's time I took responsibility for what's mine." What do you think Jackson should do now? Should he go straight to the girls and tell them the truth? Or should he take a more cautious approach? How do you think the girls will react when they find out who he really is? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The meeting with Charlotte was set for the next day. Jackson had spent the night pacing his penthouse, trying to prepare for what was to come. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. He had built empires, changed industries, and seen countless success stories. But nothing compared to the storm of emotions brewing inside him now. He wasn't sure how he would be received or how the girls would react when they learned the truth. When he arrived at Charlotte's modest home in Park Slope, Brooklyn, the street was quiet. It was a sharp contrast to the bustling energy of his usual world. Charlotte opened the door with a polite, neutral smile, but Jackson could see the wariness in her eyes. She didn't know him well, but she knew enough to understand his presence in their lives was a bombshell waiting to explode. "Come in, Mr. Montgomery," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm not sure the girls are ready for this, but I guess it's time." Jackson stepped inside, his heart beating in his chest. He had spent so long in boardrooms and business meetings where every move was calculated. Now he was walking into uncharted territory, fatherhood. He had no idea what kind of man he would be as a father or how the girls would react to him. The small, cozy living room was warm and inviting, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. Charlotte motioned for him to sit down, then disappeared into the other room. Moments later, the three girls walked in. Harper, Haley, and Hannah. They stopped in their tracks when they saw Jackson sitting there. They hadn't expected him to be there, and they certainly hadn't expected this moment to come so soon. "Hi," Jackson said, his voice steady but soft. He forced himself to smile, though it felt awkward. "I'm Jackson, Mr. Montgomery. You're our father," Harper interrupted, her voice blunt. There was no question in her eyes, no uncertainty. She was sure of it. Jackson swallowed hard. It was like being caught in a whirlwind. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am." For a moment, the room was silent. The girls stood there looking at him and then at each other. The air was thick with unspoken words, emotions, and the weight of everything they had lost. Finally, Haley spoke up, her tone more measured than Harper's. "Why did you leave Mom? Why didn't you come back?" she asked, her eyes narrowing in that way of someone who had been paying attention to every detail, always analyzing. Jackson closed his eyes for a second, trying to collect his thoughts. This wasn't a conversation he had ever expected to have, but here it was, crashing down on him. "I didn't know about you," he said quietly. "I had no idea that I was your father." The words hung in the air like a confession, and for a moment the three girls seemed to soften. Jackson could see that the weight of his words had reached them. "You didn't know?" Hannah asked, her voice softer now. "But Mom always told us about you. She kept your pictures and she talked about you. She loved you, didn't she?" Jackson's heart ached at the mention of Meredith. He had loved her once deeply, but his career had pulled him away, and he had been too selfish to see the consequences of his actions. Now all of that was coming back to him. "I loved her too," Jackson said, his voice hoarse. "I was young, and I made mistakes, but I never forgot her." Harper, who had been the most guarded, finally stepped forward. "You were the love of her life. She always talked about you, but we never knew what happened to you. You just disappeared." "I was chasing my career," Jackson admitted, "and I thought I was doing what was right. But now I realize I was wrong." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't a tense silence. It was a quiet moment of understanding. The girls had questions, and Jackson didn't have all the answers, but he was ready to give them whatever he could. "I'm sorry," Jackson said. "I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your lives now. I know it's going to take time, but I'm here. I want to help if you'll let me." Harper looked at him for a long moment, her face serious. "We don't need your money if that's what you're offering. What we need is honesty. We need to know who you are now, not who you were before." Jackson nodded, understanding her words. The offer of wealth and luxury wouldn't fix everything, but it was a place to start. He had to earn their trust, piece by piece. For the rest of the evening, they sat together in Charlotte's living room, talking. Jackson answered their questions, trying to explain the things that had shaped him, while also listening to their stories, their lives without him. He listened as they told him about their mother, about the struggles they had faced, and about the little things that made them who they were. When it was time to go, Jackson stood up, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to walk away again. The next few months were a series of small, careful steps. Jackson saw the girls regularly. He wasn't pushing to be their father right away, but he was there. They spent time together, slowly building a relationship. Jackson learned about their individual personalities, Harper's sharp intellect, Haley's scientific curiosity, and Hannah's artistic soul. And in return, the girls began to see him not just as a stranger from the past, but as someone who was trying to make up for lost time. They visited Central Park, went to museums, and even took ice skating lessons together. The girls were still unsure, still cautious, but they were starting to open up to him. It wasn't easy, but Jackson was willing to do whatever it took. One evening, after a long day spent at a science exhibit, the girls turned to him as they were getting into the car. Harper, who had been the most distant, looked at him with a soft expression. "Thank you, Dad," she said quietly. The word hung in the air, and Jackson's heart swelled with emotion. It was just a small step, but it was the first real acknowledgement that things were changing. What do you think of Jackson's journey to becoming a father to the girls? Do you think they'll ever fully accept him, or is it too late? What would you have done in his place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this story, don't forget to share it with your friends and comment the number 100 mouse if you enjoyed the ending. Where are you watching from? I'd love to know. Let's keep the conversation going and share the love.